Freedom of expression and so on in the context of Charlie Hebdo. And what I want to do is focus on the reaction to the attacks, in particular by the government, and just outline how the aftermath of the attacks led to a huge clampdown, in fact, on freedom of expression, and more than that, the intensification of a spiral of Islamophobia that's been underway in France for the last 2 or 3 decades. So I'll perhaps just start by saying that I'm going to talk about the specific development of that state of affairs in France, but I think many of although many of the aspects of it are particular to France, the example of France underlines how the potential for mobilising around national values, whether they're called Republican values or British values, as a means of stigmatising or ostracising a group in society, in particular, in the case of Muslims, the stigmatisation of the Muslim population as a whole as potential jihadists, or that wearing a hijab can be a route to jihadism or fundamentalism and so on. There are lots of common strands that indicate that what is happening in France isn't as exceptional as might first appear, because some of the stories are quite shocking about what's happened. Liz this morning talked about an 8-year-old child, Ahmed, who was put under police investigation because he blurted out during the minute's silence, I'm with the jihadists, I'm with the terrorists. Then it emerged he didn't really know what terrorism meant. By the end of January, there were about 250 people who'd been put under investigation for apology for terrorism. So Francois Hollande, the president, said every time a word is spoken that undermines Republican values, there will be a reaction. So what this meant was that the scrutiny that France's Muslim population had been put under for many, many years was ratcheted up. 14-year-old girl in a bus in Nantes says to the ticket inspectors in what was reported as a threatening tone that she and her friends were the Kouachi sisters and they were going to get out their Kalashnikovs. Put under investigation for apology for terrorism. A 16-year-old student in the same town put a drawing up on Facebook that mocked the Charlie Hebdo journalists who were killed, put under investigation for apology for terrorism. A philosophy teacher in Poitiers speculates about links between, or makes a comparison between Western imperialism and terrorism, and says French soldiers engaged in foreign interventions, makes a comparison with terrorists. He's held in custody for 8 hours, undergoes an investigation for weeks, his job is on the line and so on. Eventually the case is dropped. So there was a climate of moral panic in the weeks following, well, it's still going on really, in the weeks following the atrocities in Paris. So these various cases of people suspected of apology for terrorism were then supplemented by politicians saying, well, the ban on the hijab in schools should be extended to universities. There were various debates about whether eating pork should be a condition of entry into Republican state schools. So calls for bans on alternative menus being available in schools, because this is pandering to communitarianism, and we have a secular republic, so there should just be one menu in schools. There were a whole series of debates about the neutrality of state actors. So there was a famous case of a nursery worker who was sacked because she wore the hijab, and this was felt to be in conflict with the principle of neutrality. Now, private nurseries that receive state subsidies. They're talking about, well, people who work in those nurseries shouldn't be able to display affiliation to a religion in a visible way because that infringes the principle of secularism. There was a meeting organised against Islamophobia on the 6th of March. 500 people attended it. Biggest meeting of its kind held in France, the biggest meeting after 25 years of Islamophobic attacks. Biggest meeting on that issue. The meeting was attacked. Leading journalist, very prominent journalist, Caroline Forrest, said this meeting was spitting on the dead journalists. They argued, how can progressives align themselves with Muslim groups that oppose gay marriage? How can anti-racists make common cause with sexist and homophobic organisations? And there've been very public repudiations even of the term Islamophobia, that this is, depending on who you read, it was invented by the Muslim Brotherhood, it was invented during the Iranian Revolution to shame women who wouldn't wear the hijab. It prevents the criticism of religion. This was an example. This was a reason given by some organisations not to participate in the meeting. So the background to all this is a long process of stigmatisation that has been taking place since the 1980s. I just want to briefly outline some aspects of that. And it's essentially, at the core of it has been the use of legislation to give effectively state backing, state sanction to Islamophobia. And at the centre of this has been the manipulation of universalist values, so the distortion of universalist values in order to target Muslims, and in particular Muslim women. So when the opposition to students who wore the hijab in schools first developed, it was clear that there was a certain section of the population, from the far right to the kind of Republican centre, that didn't want school students to be able to wear the hijab, and all kinds of arguments were advanced about, it's a symbol of women's oppression. It's the patriarchal authority of Muslim fathers who are part of a radicalisation drive in the banlieue. A whole debate developed around it. The reasons given for banning the hijab were put in universalist terms. So it wasn't the hijab itself, it was that it happened to be an ostentatious sign of affiliation to a religion. The minister responsible for a circular in 1994 that urged the hijab to be banned said that the problem with it was a symbol that was so ostentatious that it divided young people. So this eventually led to a law in 2004 that banned visible or manifest symbols of affiliation to religious symbols. So that would include other symbols than the hijab, but the education minister at the time argued that as soon as anything becomes a religious symbol, it will fall under this law. So this left the way open for all kinds of garments to be interpreted as symbols of as religious symbols. So students who were trying to negotiate a path where they could practice their religion and attend school found themselves also ostracised. So there was a student who wore a bandana that covered part of her hair. This was interpreted by others as a religious symbol, so she was excluded from the school. students who wear long skirts or long dresses have been told that's a religious symbol, so you'll have to wear something else or be excluded. And so there's a whole argument that these garments are in some way provocative. The same thing happened when it came to the long debate over the niqab. Months and months of debate over whether this should be banned in public. Eventually, the law was framed in terms of covering the face in public, because covering the face in public inhibited living together. So the niqab, balaclavas, motorcyclists who didn't take their helmets off after they'd finished riding their motorcycles, hoodies. All of these can lead to a €150 fine. If somebody makes somebody else cover their face because of their gender, as it's put in the legislation, that opens them up to a €30,000 fine. So this in other words, was a kind of fake universalism. It was obvious what was being targeted, but it was framed in a way that, a bit like the legislation giving police in the early 90s the right to stop and search, the legislation was framed in terms that gave the police the right to stop somebody suspected of not having their identity papers, and they could use any criteria other than ethnic or racial characteristics, because it was a universalist law. So this has led to situations like last autumn there was a woman on holiday from the Gulf wearing a niqab in the front row of the Bastille Opera. The choir saw her and said, we won't sing until she's removed from the auditorium or she removes her niqab. So this was, the opera was La Traviata. At the end of the La Traviata there's a masked ball. The choir was only allowed to participate in the masked ball because an exception had been written into the legislation that gave theatrical performers the right to cover their face during public performances like that. So obviously all of this has a context, and the context is one that's shared by many countries. The Rushdie affair, people have talked about. A few months after the Rushdie affair, the first so-called headscarf affair emerged. The violence in Algeria, that was the context for the 1994 circular, on the hijab, the war on terror. So there's an international context that France shares with a number of other countries. The use of racism or Islamophobia as a way of diverting from other issues is not particular to France. It took a very sharp form in France when people in the banlieue, so areas where youth unemployment runs up to 40%. The employment minister at the time, in the wake of the banlieue uprising, said that the reason why so many young people are unemployed in the banlieue is because of polygamy, and young men who don't have a father figure become unemployable, and so those kind of things. I think are not particular to France. I think what has converged in France are a number of factors that I just end with outlining very briefly. The existence of a party that has consciously and consistently tried to adapt racism to new situations, the Front National, that was part of efforts in the 1970s to find ways of expressing racist ideas that wouldn't invite comparisons with fascism. So to focus on culture rather than race, that helped make their racism respectable. The fact that the dominant traditions of contemporary French politics, social democracy and Gaullism have been kind of evacuated of their content. Projects of social transformation on the part of the Socialist Party have given way to a kind of fallback reliance on the notion of Republican values. Similarly, Gaullism and its emphasis on social issues and the centrality of the state, the adoption, a kind of unenthusiastic adoption of neoliberalism, has led to a focus on scapegoating and what doesn't work. So all of these things have helped the Front National propel arguments around racism and Islam in particular to the centre of political debate, and the affiliation to this kind of new intolerant form of secularism that is a break from the Republican past that used to be about neutrality of the state and freedom of individuals to express their affiliation to their religion. That the new secularism tries to push affiliation to religion into the private sphere more and more. So there's a distortion of a Republican tradition that has disarmed anti-racists, created a blind spot that means a country that has a very strong anti-racist tradition has seen that tradition knocked out of kilter, knocked off course by what has happened. I don't think it's an irreversible situation, but it's one where people have to work out what their priorities are. And in a situation where France's Muslim population has been under systematic attack for many, many years, its dress, you know, what people wear, what they eat, whether there are separate swimming pool timetables for women, all of these things, the relentless scrutiny of France's Muslim population means that is the urgent issue for anti-racists to address, and that has to come before other questions like you know, the right to attack religions and so on have to be put in perspective, and the real danger facing France and the divisions being created have to be identified first.
Thank you very much, Jim. It definitely sets the context. Thank you. Sonny.
Thank you. I want to thank the Muslim Institute first for inviting me for the second year. And I want to thank you for sitting here at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on a Saturday listening to all of us. I can't give you the European-wide context here because I think that the situation and the context that we face in different European countries, I don't think it's helpful to lump them together. I think Britain is different in that sense, and actually in one way can be the leading example to other countries in Europe, and it's incumbent upon us to make it that leading example. In many ways it is, but I think you know, it's clearly distressing to hear about what's happening in France, and I don't think that France is very consistent on free speech issues. Although on the other hand, I think actually it's interesting that Germany has moved in the opposite direction, where you have seen the rise of Pegida, but you've also seen a bigger rise in the anti-Pegida people, and people like you know, Angela Merkel sort of not going down the UKIP route and actually saying that we have to embrace Muslims as part of the German identity, and having a real debate about multiculturalism and how you know, actually for years people who were not seen as German are now, you know, trying to embrace them. But my journey kind of starts 20 years ago when I was at university, and when I used to go to debates around religion. Actually, I didn't go to debates on religion, they were happening all around me. There was a very strong, big Asian community at Brunel University, and there were two concepts that constantly came up: the Khilafah and Khalistan. And I'm sure you're aware of what Khilafah means, but the Khalistan is in one way the Sikh equivalent to that. You know, set up during just before the British Raj. There was the first British Sikh kingdom, which was established by Maharaja Ranjit Singh, and Sikhs see that as their Sikh, as the Sikh kingdom. the sort of the ideal utopian era that we want to go back to, completely ignoring the fact that it was a dictatorship and the fact that it wasn't exactly run along Sikh lines. But nevertheless, for many Sikhs, Khalistan is become the ideal, that we want a Sikh state because the Indian government oppresses Sikhs, and this is a Sikh state would be a great way you can raise your kids and and be a true Sikh. And I found a lot of similarity between those two debates. I mean, 95, late 90s was also the years that Hizb ut-Tahrir were really popular amongst universities, setting up big conferences, plastering everywhere the Khilafah is coming, etc. Coming to Britain, and many of those people, as you know, will have then learned to set up Al-Muhajirun, famously Anju Chaudhry, and then some of them went on to join ISIS. So those were my formative years of dealing with people who were really passionate about religion. And the brothers, as my friends called them, they used to come to their campuses, their rooms next to mine, and sort of have long chats about religion. My other formative experience was when I used to run a website years ago, another 10-15 years ago, called Burfi Culture, and we used to get regular attacks from the National Front. A whole bunch of people from the National Front used to come onto our website and start posting really offensive messages. And one of the common phrases that they used was, you could approach it in two ways. When these National Front people came to our website and said, "Get out of our country, what are you doing here?" The phrase that they commonly used was, "A dog that is born in a stable does not make it a horse. It still is a dog." And the response you could have to that was, well, these people don't want me here, therefore, Britain does not accept me, and I'm not going to be British unless these people get rid of their racism. But my response was always that actually we are British despite these racists, and these racists are always going to be here, but we have to not only firmly assert our British identity, but also shape it in our own image. Those were also the years of the rise of British Asian music and the fusion sort of music, the Bali Sagoos of the day, the Punjabi MC. And in those days, actually, a lot of people used to come together to sort of form, in my days, we used to think we were forming a new British Asian identity, which was hybrid. And I'm reminded of this partly because last week I was invited to a discussion called Race on the Agenda, and a bunch of peers and some of the MPs and some of the people within the race equality industry, we were talking about how race is pushed off the agenda, and part of the complaint is that religion has taken over, religion has become the agenda, and now anti-racism has gone off the agenda. And my response was this: yes, it has happened to a certain extent, but I think we're missing a trick here, because people's identities have changed, people have moved on, and things have become a lot more complex. It's not just Muslims, as it was kind of implied in the debate, but also Sikhs and Hindus in the UK are becoming much more aware of their religious identity. My brother himself is completely different to me. He's a religious preacher. He actually goes around the country preaching Sikhism. And people often ask, how the hell are you two brothers, given that one of you doesn't spend any time on religion, the other one spends all his time preaching religion. But it's there. The point is that these identities have changed, and people's response to those identities have changed. And I said, look, I think it's important for us to recognize that racism itself has changed. It's no longer about black, as in a broad political term, versus the racists. We've got to start talking about anti-Semitism. We've got to start talking about anti-Muslim prejudice. We've got to start talking about, the fact that the whole complexity and the debate around racism has changed. Unless we bring those people in, we cannot form a broad front against anti-racism. So, going back to the question, do Muslims face an Islamophobic future the question is are we talking about short term or the long term? And I think the short term, yes, and the long term, no. And I'm reminded of this this picture when I was invited to a debate around Ugandan Asians coming to the UK, and the way that the media portrayed Ugandan Asians coming to the UK. It was the most famous one is a cartoon in the Express where you've got a picture of a black-faced queen in a parliament, and all the people in parliament. There is actually a minister for curry houses, and there is all the people in the House of Parliament, all black. Some of them wearing turbans, and funny enough, a Muslim guy is wearing a Sikh turban. Obviously the people in the Express one that they know enough about the differences. We're all blacks, so it doesn't really matter. But the point is that what's interesting to me is now that the Conservative Party goes around saying that Ugandan Asians are some of the best people, immigrants that we have in this country. These people worked hard. They set up these businesses, and we should have embraced them. We've made a mistake by sort of demonizing these people because loads of those people won't vote Conservative anymore. And if you look back at the way that this country has demonized Irish people or Catholics, this too, in one sense, this is almost like a rite of passage that every community has had to go through. So I don't think the future is pessimistic. I'm always an optimistic person. The question is, how can we challenge some of those prejudices, and what needs to happen? And that's where I'm just going to focus on a few issues. So I think that there are a few issues that we face, and I think we have to build broad alliances to deal with them. Firstly, I think we have to build a broad alliance to deal with terrorism and radicalism. I don't think that can be ignored, given the rise of ISIS and the fact that so many people, especially Anjem Choudhury and his crew, not only roam around freely, going around saying that we should have a Khilafah in the UK, but there's loads of people who also believe that it is obligatory on Muslims to go over to Syria and fight jihad, and I think that has to be challenged by all of us, not just Muslims but non-Muslims too, and I think importantly because it is affecting British Muslim lives. When girls who are 16 or 15 are being brainwashed to go over to Syria, the people who are being hurt the most are British Muslim families here. And I don't think it's helpful to have a narrative which sees radicalism as a Muslim versus a non-Muslim issue. I think the victims of ISIS have primarily been Muslims, and we have to emphasize that fact, and that's the reason why Muslims should be against not just the likes of ISIS, but the ideology that leads on to ISIS. Secondly, I think we have to be consistent on free speech and civil liberties. I mean, I'm pleased that Inayat Banglawala admitted that there were lots of mistakes made in the run-up to around Salman Rushdie, but and I'm not saying that Hindus and Sikhs are any more liberal when it comes to free speech issues. Basically, incident was one that Zia mentioned. But I get constantly attacked as a traitor to Sikhs because I am an ashamed liberal and I always stand up for free speech. But the point I'm trying to make is that unless there is consistency on free speech and civil liberty issues, then it's quite easy for the mainstream to turn around and say, well, you guys want to clamp down on free speech in these cases, but you want free speech to say offensive things. And I think that unless we are consistent on those issues and say, actually, people should be allowed to say offensive things, even if that's against my religion, then we make it easier for the racists to use free speech, or the government to use speech and civil liberties to use free speech to clamp down on our own free speech. That doesn't make any sense. To try and use to clamp down on free speech. Thirdly, I think we need to have a debate around Britishness and national identity and what that means for us. I think that any country which has a growing, a more diverse population, whether it's not just racial but also cultural, has to think about, will always have a debate around what it does it mean to be, a person who belongs to that country. And I lived in India when I was younger, and in India there is a very strong debate around what it means to be Indian. And the great thing about it is that it incorporates people not just who of different religions, but an incredibly diverse country where people speak about 50 different main languages. Sorry? Right. Not just 350. I mean, that if you include all the dialects, you're going into the thousands. So the point I'm trying to say is that we have run away from this debate around national identity because we keep on saying, well, but of course, what does it mean? And of course, having free speech and being nice to each other is a universal value, not just a British value. That may be true, but the point still is that unless we have a debate and embrace the idea of having a national identity and what that means, and asserting our right not only to be in this country, but also play a part as British people, sometimes even English people, given the inevitable breakup of the Union. We can't take this debate forward because people will always challenge, like the National Front did, challenge our identity, and we always have to assert that yes, we are British. You can't do anything about it, and we will assert our identity as British, and we will help and change this country as Brits. And lastly, I know I'm running out of time, secularism. I think that we have to assert the importance of secularism, not atheism, but secularism, a state which treats all religions equally, and challenge the idea that, for example, the likes of Hizb ut-Tahrir or even Sikh organizations, or even what the Hindu government in India is doing to its minorities, and say actually the right ideal is a country that treats all religions equally and is not a country that preferences one religion over others, because that to me is a supremacist state. A country that says one religion gets preferential treatment and others don't, to me is being racist in one sense. It is being supremacist in one sense. So I think that we have to have this argument about secularism too, and point out to people like Hizb ut-Tahrir and others that actually secularism helps us because we are allowed to practice our religions more easily in a secular state than a country that says actually you're allowed to do this but you're not allowed to do that. Because all the countries that are not secular, I'm talking about South Asia, the Middle East, those countries always inevitably clamp down and hit hard the minorities the first. If you think about Ahmadis in Pakistan, you think about Muslims and Christians in India, those are the people who are always going to be hit hardest if you have a country that preferences one religion over others. So I think those are the four debates that we need to have going forward to help improve relations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Myriam.
Yes. I wanted to come back before I sort of touch on my own points. First off, obviously, thank you for having me. Some of the things that Jim said about France, I don't know that I necessarily accept the idea that France has a non-racist or a solid anti-racist history. I think actually maybe the Fifth Republic itself is constructed on quite a racist premise, and I think actually racism is built into a lot of conceptions of national identity, France in particular. And I also identified with a lot of the examples that you gave because, as my name might indicate, I hold a French passport. And one of the examples that I had recently was of a friend of mine who was wearing the long skirts and the bandana and at school, and being told that she could no longer attend because this was now considered to be, her skirt was considered to be an ostentatious sign of her religion. And the great irony in this situation was that she was friends at school with a young girl who was a goth, who used to dress like a goth. So she used to wear a sort of turban, so even bigger than a bandana, an actual turban, dressed in sort of black, long, flowing clothes, who converted to Islam while at school and was never challenged on what she wore to school. And that this young woman was challenged on a bandana, a long skirt, and even on the colour of her clothing. Black was considered somehow to be indicative of identification with some sort of a regime, Lord knows who. There could be Iran or Saudi Arabia, despite the fact to any Muslim that's worth their 2 cents would realise that there'd be some internal contradictions with assuming it could be both. So I mean, there are some really, really serious issues, I think, in France with the hardening and the politicisation of the notion of laïcité, and I felt like you touched on those amazingly. And all the cases I've been following very closely. But I also think that our own version of this hardening of the notion of laïcité, or the politicisation of the notion of laïcité, our version, the UK equivalent of that, is muscular liberalism. That's the hardening of a term which is considered to be constitutive of British identity, and which is then reformulated, reworked in order to advance very specific political goals which involve the marginalisation of certain sections of the population, and specifically, though through the claims to greater universal principles, in this case liberalism, the hammer will fall on a broader scope of people than Muslims exclusively. But as that happened with the headscarf, Sikhs and Jews also ended up being penalised. We know full well that the law was designed, in essence, to target young Muslim women. Muslim women of school age, certainly. So in terms of the question, I just wanted to say a couple of things. So do Muslims in the West face an Islamophobic future? Well, I'll start with sort of trying to define whether we face an Islamophobic presence, and I would look at, how would you assess whether or not we're facing an Islamophobic presence? Well, I would say first off, you would look at the fact that anything to do with Muslim communities is extremely polarizing. That anytime you have a discussion about anything, be it Charlie Hebdo, face veils, halal, circumcision, ISIS, it becomes constructed as a civilizational clash between Muslims and Islam on one side, and the Western values of freedom and blah, blah, effing blah on the other. Excuse my French. I think that's really indicative of the sense that Islamophobia has become such a currency in political debates in the media that we can't avoid even things that should be assessed more cool-headedly, turning into the opportunity to define ourselves, quote unquote, in the West in opposition to the historical other, in this case Muslims. So Charlie Hebdo, instead of being, interestingly, I was at a discussion recently and I said, if you think that Charlie Hebdo was an attack on free speech because it was an attack on some cartoonists primarily, then it's as short-sighted as thinking that 9/11 was an attack on the financial centre. Evidently, the planes were flown into financial centres. They were symbols for the attackers of something much greater. Similarly, in this case, we had the Kouachi brothers defining themselves, that their allegiance to Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda's a history of choosing very symbolic targets as part of precisely this effort to advance the notion that they are fighting a sort of civilizational battle. And ISIS, of course, that Koulibaly identified with, who is very much seeking to create a sense that Western Europe is not a place where Muslims can ever feel at home, and therefore, if you can't feel at home, well, why don't you pop over to our Khilafah out here where things are great. Obviously the big trap was to fall into this, and I was at the BBC recently discussing how, the immediate sense in which people were willing to jump onto the bandwagon of free speech versus Islam was extremely troubling, an indication of this sort of polarization. Every time one of these things props up, it's this polarization which is indicative of, I'm not going to repeat it, but this sort of notion of sides, a civilizational struggle with Muslims on one hand, a sort of internal threat to Western societies that needs to be monitored, regulated, policed closely. The second indication, or I think of an Islamophobic presence, is what I would call a lack of allies. So I would like to think that when what we might call, what's the right word, traditional forms of racism are brought to public attention. In France, our Justice Minister, Christiane Taubira, having a banana thrown at her. She's of Guyanese background. There was public uproar in France, but also more broadly. I don't see that uproar when it comes to Muslims. Where are our allies? Where are the people who stand up for those things when it comes to our things? So recently we had Nigel Farage in an interview with Trevor Phillips, of all people, illustrious as he has been in his career, talking about talking about Muslims as a fifth column. The language of fifth column is the language of conspiracy theories. It is the language of the far right. It is the language which suggests that we are an enemy within. Where were people to call this out? Where were our allies? And this is the point at which I think Islamophobia is, so omnipresent that even when it seems to me it shouldn't be a question I should even have to raise. And in fact, I got asked by a very prominent left-wing newspaper to write an article in response to Farage's comments, and I didn't want to. Why should I, as a Muslim, have to respond to this issue? Where's everybody else? Why do I have to point out that this is wrong? I'm not doing it. If you can't see that there's a problem, I don't need to point it out to you. Oh, let me help you understand that there's an issue of prejudice in society. No, just open your eyes and it's there. And I'm sort of tired at a certain level of having to help people come to terms with their own prejudice. Actually, I don't think that it's the job of minorities to help the majority come to terms with their racism. Where are the anti-racism campaigners who, and there's a broader issue, in fact, in dialogue that I've had with many of them who refuse to recognize Islamophobia as a flavor of racism, as a hybrid, as a reformulation to adapt to a different set of circumstances in which traditional forms of racism are less socially acceptable and therefore have to be rethought in terms of their articulation. And so, do we face an Islamophobic future? Well, look, the present ain't that great. I mean, Trojan Horse is, to me, the big recent story that I have huge issues with. Some of you might be aware that there was an educational committee review of what happened in these schools, which found only one incident which could possibly be conceived of as extremism. I don't know how many of you saw that as a headline on any major newspapers. No, none. That's because it wasn't, unlike all the other headlines that talked about extremism in Birmingham schools, which have affected an entire generation of children whose school grades dropped dropped dramatically as a consequence of this spurious investigation that has tarred an entire community and an entire generation of children. And that is a huge scandal. No front pages for that, though. Desecrations of graveyards. There was just one in Scotland, I think, yesterday or the day before. Attacks on mosques and individuals. I mean, I hate to bring it to a personal story, but a friend of mine was on the tube the other day, and somebody grabbed her by the back of her headscarf. A well-to-do gentleman in a suit in the morning rush hour, and accused her of hiding a bomb under it and of being a jihadi bride. These are things, and the police refuse to recognise this, incidentally, as an Islamophobic crime. This will not be recorded as an Islamophobic crime because the Metropolitan Police have not yet defined what constitutes an Islamophobic crime. So it'll go down as assault. But when we come to those figures, and people say, well, the figures aren't that bad. Well, there are some reasons the figures aren't that bad. A lot of people don't report what happens to them, and B, when it comes to reporting, people aren't clear, or the police specifically don't appear to be very clear on how to record those incidents. I don't share Sunny's optimism about the response to the Pegida marches. I think Germany, as you rightly pointed out, is quite a different concept. 17,000 people marched in the Pegida march. That's 17,000 people. I just want you to think about that for a second. That's not a small number. And although Angela Merkel did come out and I think rightly made a strong statement seeking to mitigate that, particularly I think that speech was aimed at an international level where she would have been condemned had she not taken a strong stance, particularly given Germany's history. But the evidence that I see from within Germany, from Muslims within Germany, is certainly not one that suggests that there's been an attempt to embrace its Muslim population in any sense of the term. I'm guessing you need me to wrap up, but so if I could just end on one final point, which I think is a broader point about the fact that I think that, in terms of the future, I think the public sphere is currently one in which there is a real hostility to religion in general and Islam in particular, which obviously is fed by the sort of cycles of hysteria that we see. Could the future be less bleak? Well, as any good addict will tell you, you can't solve the addiction unless you actually address that it exists. And similarly, unless we actually recognize that Islamophobia is real and does exist, and we stop having spurious debates about whether we should call it anti-Muslim hate or Islamophobia, or does it really exist, or is it just, Muslims are a bit sensitive to people being rude about their faith? Evidently not. There's a lot more to it than that, but unless we start accepting that it's real, we can't start addressing it. For me, the fact that one of the most senior Muslim politicians in our government has been isolated, the first person to really call out Islamophobia as having passed the dinner table test, and frankly, you couldn't find more institutionalized than a Tory. The fact she's been marginalized, I'm talking about Baroness Varsi in case you were under any illusions, doesn't suggest to me that the future looks particularly bright. Having said that, resistance.
Thank you very much to all three. Okay, I know we're running right over time, but I think I'll take 5 comments, but they've got to be 1 minute each. So I'm going to clock you, right? Literally, it's got to be 5 comments, 1 minute each. And just to kick off, it seems to me that actually all 3 speakers were kind of saying that there isn't a roadmap to the future in one sense. To quote Karl Marx, if I may, all of this solid melts into air, and that is part of our problem in one sense, is that there isn't actually, if you like, the certainties of what was anti-racism, what is racism, does Islamophobia exist, who are our allies. All these kind of certainties we might have had in the past have actually been thrown up in the air. So I think that's kind of how I'd like to frame it. So sorry, 5 people, 5 hands. Back 1 minute, 1 minute, 1 minute, 1 minute, and 1 minute.
Okay, can I want to comment on the Pegida, because I've taken part in the anti-Pegida movement very strongly in Germany, and I will be interested next Monday when there's going to be another march. And you see, I think you actually underestimated the number of people that marched in favour of it. There was at least 25,000.
Wow, well, I was going on The Guardian, yeah.
On several occasions, but also big numbers, so not as big as that in other cities in Germany, but mostly in the east. Now, but on the other hand, I think you should be able to take something from the counter mobilisations, because interest in itself, at least 35,000 marched on a separate day. In Munich, again 25,000. In Leipzig, so that all of these cities are in the east, and this is one of the key things. We have to look at how it works out in Germany. In Berlin, Pegida have never managed to mobilise more than 150 people. You know, so it is quite important to say that. But I actually agree with you on the question of Merkel. Although Merkel did, speak out against it, and that was very important. In actual fact, it suits the needs of her economy. Her party, however, in Bavaria, is actually fairly much in cahoots with the Pegida.
Take you next.
I'll be less than a minute. It's a kind of selfish question. So I'm doing some PhD research into aggressive cinema, and I'm kind of worried at the minute, or curious about what you think about the future of Muslim or more broadly Arab North African creative industries in France, as well as across Europe, particularly France post-Charlie Hebdo, especially those that are reliant on French funding in particular, and French audiences and beyond.
So you can talk to afterwards. Okay, who do I point out next? Yes. 1 minute.
I just wanted to pick up on a point I tried to make in the morning, which is that quite rightly today we've been looking at the attack on Muslims and Islamophobia and how Muslims should respond, and that's right. But I think because Muslims are the target of are being targeted by Islamophobia, but they are not the only target. I think this is really important. See, in 1920, a big article was run in the Illustrated Sunday Herald. It was an article about Jews, and the article's divided into sections. I just need to name the sections because I think you'll get the idea of where the article was going. Good Jews and bad Jews was the first section. National Jews, these were the good Jews. National Jews was the second section. International Jews, very bad. Terrorist Jews, very, very bad. And the final section was the duty of the loyal Jew. And within it were the most anti-Semitic tropes you can imagine. Jewish Bolsheviks, names of Jews in Russia, communist Jews, etc. You would think that the author was a Nazi or something. Actually, the author was Winston Churchill. Now, why was that article written? Not because he was a Nazi. Why was that article written in 1920? Because Britain was involved in the civil war in Russia, where the white armies were killing Jews. In the East End of London, the Jewish community, communist, anarchist, Zionists, all opposed the white armies and the intervention, and they had been big anti-conscription campaigns in the East End during the First World War. They were seen as a threat, and they were targeted. But the reason this spread, it wasn't just Churchill, it was right across Europe, this narrative at the time. Right across Europe. In Britain it was turned down, it was turned round. But in Germany it wasn't. In other countries it wasn't. It wasn't Hitler who invented the formulation Jewish Bolshevik. They picked it up from an establishment narrative that was entrenched across 10 years and more, in Europe. And my conclusion, I think, is this, that there are a lot of arguments and debates about interpretations of religion, questions of gender, attitudes to women, and so on. The prime task here is to unite arm in arm first, march side by side, and while we're doing that, then we can have those debates and arguments, but we need to get the priorities right.
My name is Nasser Bhatt. I've been in politics here for about 25 years. And what I found recently, apart from France and Germany, I was in Germany last month, and I was talking to some Muslims there. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned, I wanted to mention, was that the schooling system there is such that the immigrants are being blocked by teachers. If the teacher is racist, that actually blocks the grades to stops them from going to university. So a large number of minorities never make it to university after school. So that was part of the embedded racist system that's fed in. While I was there, I also met Noor and 4 other Muslims who started a political party in Denmark, and they wanted to have a discussion on how the British Muslims have gone into politics and how they are going to cope, because Denmark is one of those countries which is extremely racist there. And I think there is a European-wide, and UK is not far behind. And I think the whole agenda for future Islamophobia is going to be there. It's going to get stronger because there's a European push from each other at the European level. But I think that there is also hope in Britain first and then other countries later, because Britain, the Muslims in the public debate, there's a great diversity, there's a great variety, there's a great number. There may be individuals, self-appointed, or organizations have actually got focus on having media, spokespersons, etc. I think in Britain we are far better equipped to actually tackle Islamophobia. It's going to be there, but I think we've got an more optimistic future than the rest of Europe.
Final word.
Oh, right. I want to take issue with Sunny on the point about secularism, that we're all safe under the secularist banner. I think that this is well. I think that you are suggesting that a secular society is the best way of protecting religion, and I would seriously disagree with that, for the simple reason that secularism itself is a supremacist notion. To be in a secular society, to believe in religion is to mark yourself down as a lesser being, one who has to be tamed by secular values. And I think that this is inherently part of the Islamophobic mindset. If you look at the formulations of secular society that there have been, none of them have actually been secular. The United States, for all of its idea that we separate church and state to defend the rights of people to believe in whatever they want, religion is central to American politics and always has been. There are more questions to be solved, and secularism is part of the problem as much as religion is, because it has to resolve. I mean, I would suggest to you, for example, that India had a notion of secular society that was actually accepting of religion before it became a Hindu supremacist state, which is a rather modern development. The old Gandhian formulation of India as a secular society was a very different model about how religious identities and various identities cohered in a state. We have to explore the idea of secularism as much as we have to explore the idea of religion, and all of them have to be equally self-critical, rather than saying secularism is what saves you from the naive beliefs of being religious.
I'm going to I'll let you come back on that one, and then I'm going to let our other two panelists also to pick up on a couple of questions which have been raised, and then I'll put it back out to you again. So.
Sure. As I said, secularism isn't atheism. So secularism isn't a state which represses religion, and in fact, as you pointed out, the United States is a state where it is secular, but also religion plays a very important part in their everyday life. And now it's getting to a state where, for example, they have to deal with the fact that a Hindu congresswoman wanted to do her thingy the oath on a Bhagavad Gita rather than on a Bible. So I think there is a danger of assuming that secularism equals France, which it doesn't. And the point is that secularism is a platform which says a state should treat all religions equally, and I don't see that as a supremacist system, other than saying we need to have a system which gives everyone an equal platform. and a state which says that all religions, and that the state does not preference one religion over the others and treats all religions equally, to me is secularism. And I don't see that as imposing views more than saying actually everyone should have equal rights. It's a bit like saying anti-racism is a form of fascism, because you are basically saying that everyone should treat people equally. I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me, because anti-racism isn't imposing views. It's basically telling people treat other people equally. So yes, there are different forms of secularism. India has one. It's not a perfect one, actually, you know. But the point is that the people now who are undermining the Indian system are people who go around saying secularism is horrible. Why are they doing that? Because they want an Indian state. Why is Netanyahu able to, you know, do what he does? Because he wants to undermine the idea of, you know, he wants to make Judaism preferential in Israel and make, you know, and create a two-tier system. There is already a two-tier system. I'm not denying any of that. But the point is that, you know, what Israel is doing, what Pakistan has been doing, in the way it treats its minorities, and the way India has been doing. Those are problems because these people want to preference one religion over others. What is the absence of that? The absence is a state which treats every religion equally. That's a secular state. Now you can have different versions of it. There's no ideal version. But secularism in no way is imposing, you know, views on other people. It's saying everyone should have an equal platform.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask Jim. I've just asked Jim to talk a little bit more about the meeting that took place a few weeks ago, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. In Paris, that brought these people together that you referenced in your speech. Just a little bit more detail.
Yeah, so it's a meeting that was called by about 80 different organisations and was divided between representatives of associations, some connected to the radical left, some not, and eyewitnesses. The most shocking part were the eyewitness accounts. I mean, parents of school students who'd been, you know, one kid walked into class with a hood on, the teacher grabbed the hood and said, "No jihad is in here." Another was accused of shouting out during the minute's silence, "Down with Charlie Hebdo, long live the Quran." And, you know, false accusation. He's picked up at his home and taken to the police station, and the officer interviewing him says, "Are you Charlie?" So the kid says, "At the moment I don't feel very Charlie, no." And the father was explaining how proud he felt of his son, but a lot of the parents were saying, "What are we?" In fact, there was one. There was a woman who said that she, for a moment, regretted having taken her daughter on a march against the bombings in Gaza, because her daughter's response to the Charlie Hebdo murder was to say, "Look at all these people who didn't shed a tear when hundreds of kids are getting killed in Gaza, and then these journalists get killed," and so on, and then got into a discussion about the role of Jews in the media and so on. And the mother was explaining, you know, you have to make a distinction between Zionism and Judaism and so on, but effectively was asking the question, what is going to happen to our kids if they're constantly battered over the head with these Islamophobic reactions? What kind of a response is that going to generate? And I think that's where the question of allies also comes in. If people feel themselves to be so isolated, that can produce reactions of desperation. And I think part of the part of it is about it's like the Pegida thing, how incidents are picked up on and turned into kind of fantasy scare stories. So you think of the referendum in Switzerland, to stop the building of mosques, you know, a country where there are hardly any mosques. The Trojan horse. What was Gove's response to the Trojan horse thing? Not to apologise for months and months of outlandish stories about radicalisation and schools being taken over, but we must defend British values. You know, as if, well, there was really a problem all along. Anyway, exactly the same with the way that the niqab has been built up into this. You know, it affects a fraction of 1% of Muslims of Muslim women in France wear the niqab, but it's built into this moral panic about the links between Islam and fundamentalism, and that, I think, is why when we talk about secularism, it's not none of these things. It's like the debate about universalism. They don't just exist in the abstract. They are changed by these processes. So people in France will refer back to the separation of church and state in 1905. There was a debate at that time about whether, once the Catholic Church had been separate from the state, should priests be able to wear the soutane, you know, ecclesiastical robes in public. So all the arguments deployed were exactly the same. The words were the same as the arguments used about the hijab. It's a provocation. The priests who wear it, you know, their dignities, that they're prisoners, they're slaves. And the response of the authors of the law was to say, but after separation, the soutane, the ecclesiastical robes, become a garment like any other. So, you know, now, so we can look back and say, yes, there was a kind of perfect secularism. We have to bear in mind also, this was a profoundly Catholic country where people knew that the form that secularism took would take that into account. So school children have bank holidays for every Catholic festival because there's the French secular tradition incorporates that Catholicism. So they are subject to pressures and balance of forces in society, and that's part of what's at stake here, I think, is confronting the stigmatization of Islam as an attempt to drive expressions of affiliation to Islam into the private sphere and to develop a much more intolerant version of a distortion of an idealized notion of secularism.
Thank you. I was just going to ask you to, if we were to try and construct this roadmap, where would we start? What kind of components do you think we need to put in place?
Well, a few of them mentioned already now. So the identification and cultivation of allies, I think, is crucial. I mean, I think there needs to be much greater dialogue between Muslim campaigners and campaigners on other issues of discrimination, so that we can find common ground and, as the gentleman said, march together. Because I think even where there may be differences on other issues, that there are issues that are overlapping. Certainly the Pew poll, for example, in 2008 showed that those who demonstrate Islamophobic attitudes tend also to hold anti-Semitic views. So there's definitely some work to be done collaboratively. The other issue is, I think, to engage politically and in the media, and that doesn't necessarily mean take on the role of a media spokesperson, but, you know, letters, call-ins, knowing your MP, making sure that your MP is aware of the issues that you're concerned about. I mean, my MP used to be David Burrows, and David Burrows is about as pro-Israel as you can get, and but he was very well aware of my views. He didn't agree with them, but we had chats. So I think those things are important, even if they don't necessarily render the fruit immediately. and then I think the third point is what you're doing today, which is forging and maintaining safe spaces where we can come and air our concerns and devise strategies, because I think there's a lot of pressure to sort of bow, really, and that's what I feel, certainly. And I definitely feel that I'm being pushed in the opposite direction. I've definitely got angrier in the last few years, angrier and more likely to take a quote unquote radical stance, because I think there's so much pressure to accept that you must concede to British values, quote unquote, whatever they mean, actually a stick to beat us over the head with. You must concede that liberalism is the ultimate paradigm. Actually, in a free society, I'm fairly sure that you have a right to be a, what's the right word that's not rude for somebody that's not very nice, whatever that word is. And the other point is about this issue of secularism. So I think the problem with viewing secularism as some sort of golden calf is that you assume that it's the culmination of human cogitation. So somehow, you know, Western society is more evolved, and we have devised this fail-proof outlook, which is the best. And it may or it may not be, but I think that there are actually historical examples where, certainly in Islamic history, the idea that you would give different communities autonomy in terms of their self-governance, and there are issues with that as well. I'm not saying it was perfect, but there are alternative ways to manage diversity, and I think we need to be open to the possibility that, you know, the global south might have something to say on these issues which might be of worth, and it's not necessarily the case that we in the quote-unquote West have devised to quote Fukuyama, end of history solutions in all areas.
That's it, isn't it? Okay, I'll ask another show of hands. I know Sammy wants to say anything. Anyone else? Yes. So let Sammy go first, and then you, Cerrah, and then you back. Yes.
And what I found is that one of the challenges we faced as communities, the real chasm between perception and reality in terms of Islamophobia. I mean, I've had so many of my, you know, kind of quite white liberals, sort of, you know, left-wing friends talking about the fact that, you know, well, you know, Islam is like the last taboo. We can't say anything about Islam. You can't criticize Islam.
You can bomb and exterminate entire countries and populations, but criticize their religion?
Yeah,
come now.
Exactly. So that's what I mean by this chasm between, you know, perception and reality. And people really genuinely believe that, oh well, can't say anything about the Muslims, you know, and the reality is so far from that.
Yeah.
And I think that's a struggle we face when you talk about Islamophobia. People are like, well, but we're all walking on eggshells around you Muslims, and you know, we can't say anything, and it's so difficult to negotiate that sort of. And I think that's why, you know, that's why we don't have allies, because you know, people really have these false perceptions.
I think the answer to that is that if we're marching arm in arm, then we can discuss freely and in detail. I came here this afternoon having been at the Stop the War Coalition steering committee, so I picked up a few of these. And I think we've got a right to be quite proud in this country that from the very first day that the Stop the War Coalition was set up after 9/11, one of the principles was opposition to Islamophobia and all forms of racism. And I do think that means that you do have allies. They may not get a fair showing in the mainstream media, but I'm afraid I'm not able to control that. Oh well, we would. But I was out on the street last Saturday with about 999,000 other people standing up to racism, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And it was a really, I mean, I was way out of place there because it was a very, very young and vibrant demonstration. And I do think we've got a right to be proud in this country that, unlike the left in France, I mean, our equivalent, as it were, in France, have been very cowardly and hypocritical. And on the word hypocrisy, I'd like to take Sonny up on the idea of Britishness, because I don't think anybody could come up with an idea of Britishness that would be acceptable to the ruling class that I could sign up to. And in my opinion and my experience, historically, there has only been one British value in which the British ruling class has been consistent, and that is the value of hypocrisy. And it's not actually the value I want to sign up to. Now, my younger daughter teaches geography. She claims that a geography is anything that geographers do. I would like to claim that Britishness is anything that people who are British want it to be. And I think it should be. I think it should be fluid. I think it should develop. I think it should be diverse in itself and multiple. Somebody, he's actually the principal of Music College in Newark, made an absolutely brilliant statement it's on Facebook about what it is to grow up having multiple identities, to be bilingual, to be multicultural, and I think that this is what we want Britishness. I want Cameron. So let us forge what we want for our own identities, and let the future generations forge their identities.
In the context of West Islamophobia in the Western societies and countries, I'm going to slightly change the topic slightly. I live in London, but I'm actually American. How many of you have heard of CVE as a framework?
CVE?
What is it?
CVE, yeah.
This is countering violent extremism.
Countering violent extremism.
Okay.
It's a framework that the United States government put into place recently, which has also impacted the framework that France has taken over recently after Charlie Hebdo. What my question and really want to understand is, why are these legislations and frameworks openly being put in place, which I think are quite hideous because they don't understand the context? And why is that the case? Like, who is tackling this problem? Who is challenging government to say, do you understand what these frameworks do, without just basically putting a framework and just applying it to all society in general, in airports, the way people are? There's an official infographic, which I believe had come out in France. You can have a look at it on Twitter, which states all these different things of what CVE stands for. What is a profile of someone who could be extremist? Now, as a Muslim, if you look at it, you probably have a laugh, because some of you might have seen it. And to me, that's like, okay, if you do all these things except, do something that is quite, it's a profile of someone who's depressed, except the fact that you might also be looking at something that is extreme on YouTube, that means you're extremist. Like, why is that the case? It sounds really stupid, but that's what governments are advocating. How do we tackle that?
But the thing about that is
on that basis, everybody who watches the Walking Dead is an extremist.
Yeah, exactly.
But the thing about that is that it was so humorous that you wanted to laugh, but actually it's deadly serious, because what they said which was actually, it was a commissioned report by a think tank that was being used by the French government to identify signs of radicalization, and it included things like no longer wanting to attend the cinema, and changing your dietary habits with an image of a baguette with a large cross through it. So don't go gluten-free, people, because that evidently is a sign that you're on the wrong path.
We'll switch to theatre.
Yeah, but I mean, the thing is, you almost do want to laugh, but it's very serious. It's very serious, because if that's how low the bar is, there's nowhere to go with it, really, except, I'm calling underground resistance now, and I forget anything else. We've tried the rest.
Right, I'll take that off the tape. That one. No, I did notice when I went to America last, there was stop the Islamisation of America posters up everywhere. Until you realise that I think Muslims are about 0.2 to 0.4% of the American population, is it?
Very small.
So it's going to take a hell of a long time, isn't it? Anyway, who else?
Yeah, no, but you say that, but I was at a discussion at the BBC recently where somebody raised the issue of Muslim demographics and how that's going to impact on British society, and I had to point out that Muslims are currently around 3% of the European population. Predictions are that by 2030 they'll be at most 7%. As I had to point out to this audience, even if every single one of that 7% was an ISIS radical, and sorry to point out, but there might be a few in there that don't subscribe to completely loony views and are out to subvert the nature of European society, they still couldn't do it. 7%, people, get a grip. really. I mean, the demographics issue is consistently being raised in the media. We hear it all the time. Muslim demographics, birth rates, front page of the Times, Muslim birth rates.
No.
Now, our kids, our babies are threatening to people. How much further does it need to go? Our babies, my child is scary to you. I'm done. Really, I'm done. When my baby is a threat to you, we're done.
This is where Breivik came from in Norway. I mean,
No,
there's an even smaller percentage of the
Yeah.
population in Norway, and yet they were afraid of the Islamization of Norway.
Well, how many Muslims are there in Dresden?
That's
2%.
interesting, yeah.
How many Jews were there in Berlin?
Do you know?
Oh, it was less than that.
Less than 2%.
That. There you go. So actually, you can tell how Islamophobia borrows from older biological forms of racism, really, can't you? That's really what. But of course, it's been tried and tested in Europe very recently, Bosnia.
Yeah.
That's what that was all about. If you listen to what Radko Malik says, they're outbreeding us. That's why we've got to destroy them. So it is a serious question. Yes.
Yeah, you talk about allies, and where are allies? I mean, do you feel that Muslims need to be allies to other groups, like against homophobia or against anti-Semitism? So it's all too well to ask about allies, but are we allies to other groups?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question because I think there's a lot of resistance. I mean, I'll come to particularly groups that work against homophobia. I think there's a lot of resistance to it because the assumption is that if you want to ally with groups who fight against homophobia, that's somehow going to make you an inconsistent person of faith. I'd like to think that campaigning against anyone being attacked in our society or demonized in our society wouldn't be against anybody's faith, whatever your views are on people's personal behavior. And I think that's where we need a much, maybe a much more honest discussion internally about what it means, because I think there's a lot of mutual suspicion with anti-homophobia campaigners that I've met, that this sense that Muslims can't be genuine partners in that struggle, and I just sort of think, who's pro people being attacked and demonized? I mean,
yes.
Is the premise of this today flawed then? Is it that the Muslims are not intolerant? It's just everyone else is intolerant of Muslims? It seems to be where we kind of got to at the end of the day.
Well, do Muslims have issues of intolerance? Yeah, I mean they're like everyone else, which is something I find myself having to point out quite regularly. Like, yeah, we're people like everyone else.
But I think
same
there's a
kind of problem.
Yeah, but there is a context there, which is that all this craziness around, oh my God, the Muslims has sort of jumped up over the last year since ISIS has become much more prominent. And I think that it does relate a lot to what's happening internationally and the threat of terrorism, and as a result of that, the fears that get magnified around, what could happen if these people did become radicalized. So I don't think it's useful to think that it's completely divorced and this is going to go on the same trajectory. I think that the trajectory of a lot of the Islamophobia and anti-Muslim prejudice is very closely correlated to acts of terrorism or acts of what's happening in the Middle East. So I don't think it's useful. Well, I mean, before ISIS became prominent in June last year, before that, actually things were not great. But stories around Al Qaeda. I mean, the one measure I have of this is how many times is Douglas Murray on TV, basically. And Douglas Murray is one of the key people who pushes this pushes anti-Muslim prejudice. And his profile and television has gone to the roof since ISIS has become more prominent. So I think it is correlated.
I'm just gonna let a couple of people come in, and then I'll let you come back. I'll let you come back at the end. Yeah.
I'd just like to say, I enjoyed this conference in honesty. It was very interesting, very stimulating, and discovered lots of new things and everything. But let's say, just for the sake of argument, that I was there all the time. That I knew all that. I was aware of all this that's being said, and more or less. I mean, apart from the details, I know all this. And that's great. But where do I go from here?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's what we're trying to grapple with, I think. Yes.
I I'm not a Muslim, I'm humanist, but I think what the Muslim Institute is trying to do here is fantastic, and I think we should all work very hard to try and bring various communities together, and in my view that happens best when you actually get physically to meet people and see them as fellow human beings.
Yeah, agreed.
But there are things which I've heard over the past couple of sessions which I think it's not helping. It's not helping to pretend that there were no problems with the Trojan horses in Birmingham. There were problems. The criticism wasn't the finding of the reports. The criticism was that there was a sort of hysterical reaction and multiple reports, and these poor kids were being sort of trampled all over by multiple inquiries. It wasn't criticising the findings, and the findings were that there were real things happening. It doesn't help to deny.
Sorry, that's incorrect.
I'll let you come back.
Sorry, that is correct.
No, absolutely not.
Similarly, I agree that actions by the government that will seek to demonise Muslims by making people feel the enemy and prevent and all of those things, may be going in the wrong direction. But there is a problem with terrorism. I was in London at 7/7. It's bloody frightening. There is a problem. There has to be.
Well, we're Muslims, so we're immune to bombs.
Sorry?
I said we're Muslims, so we're immune to bombs.
Muslims
That when they go off, they don't hit us.
But the answer must be to come and say, okay, this isn't the right way to tackle violent extremism. This is the right way to do it. What is the right way? So
okay.
It does. Okay. Well, sorry.
All right. Yeah. Well, no, I'm gonna have to end it there because we've got. I'm gonna give our panelists 1 minute each, just to come back and sum up.
Just 1 minute.
Yeah, but the panelists must try to answer this question.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Because there is a problem with violent extremism, and it cannot be brushed aside, no matter how victimized we may feel.
Okay. Yes. Sorry. Go on.
Okay, I had made so many notes. It's going to be difficult to put it into 1 minute.
I'll give you 2.
Okay, so there are loads of reasons for optimism. Like there are constantly stories about. There have been stories about black babies. There have been stories about minorities. The demographic problem couched in racial terms about minorities. And actually, the UK is still become successively one of the most tolerant countries in the world. So I don't think that it necessarily means that you're going to end up with gas chambers. 2007, the BNP had an explicit party political broadcast which was focused on Muslims, and they thought actually they were going to go really far by focusing on Islamophobia and the threat of terrorism. Actually, the BNP have since collapsed, as you all know. So it doesn't necessarily mean that one leads to another. I'm saying that these things go in cycles. The point is actually, and the key crux of this is, shall we all hold hands together in unity and somehow we're going to defeat racism? I don't think that's possible at all. And so the point is that, am I going to march next to someone from Hizb ut-Tahrir? Obviously not. Am I going to march somewhat? Am I going to say nothing when a Muslim ISOC at a London university invites over a preacher at one of their national conferences, a guy who has on the record said, about killing gays, about killing ex-Muslims, and all that kind of stuff? I'm not saying that we should not have allies which are non-Muslims. Absolutely, we can have allies, and we should push for allies across, religions, across races, etc., etc. But to pretend that the allies could include everyone from all communities is farcical. It's not going to happen. If you say I should be allied with every single Muslim group, that's not going to happen. I mean, I was last week and a few weeks ago criticizing quite harshly Cage for going around saying that Mwazi was a beautiful man and he was radicalized by the MI5. I mean, there are loads of black kids every day on the streets who are harassed by the police. They don't go and join ISIS. So this idea that you know, ISIS was he was radicalized by the MI5 is completely ridiculous.
No, they go and stab Lee Rigby.
Sorry?
I said no, they go and stab Lee Rigby.
Well, wait, they went with Anjem. You know, those guys were involved quite closely with Anjem Choudhury. So the point I'm trying to make is that there is no way in hell that liberals or seculars are going to start allying themselves with people who want gays to be killed, or who think that establishing a khilafah is a great idea. You know, so having these, if we want cross, group allies, then we have to be clear about what exactly is the basis of those negotiations and the basis of those allies. And you know, the Stop the War is a good example of a group which has published loads of stuff and defended George Galloway after his comments around rape. You know, so this idea that I'm going to somehow ally myself with Stop the War coalition is also becoming farcical these days, given the stuff that they publish on their website. So I think it's important for us to have shared values, and those shared values, I believe, are real. It can be anti-racism, it can be based around secularism, it can be based around fighting racism and extremism in all forms. But that has to mean that we together then fight extremism and Islamism as well as racism by Sikhs, by Hindus towards Muslims, and all the rest of it. But that cannot be tackled if one community says we don't want to tackle people. You know, if you're, I'm referring here to Catherine earlier today, saying, you know, lumping everything together, every issue together, as if that is somehow, you know, if we somehow criticize rather than rape gangs, we are now making an attack on all Muslims. So. No, I'm saying that's the implication. If you are saying that this was all part of a narrative, the rape gangs and ISIS and everything, then you're effectively saying any criticism of any part of that, anyone who's Muslim, means that you're launching an attack on all Muslims. So what I'm saying is that, yes, we should have allies. And actually, but the question is, we still haven't figured out what common values those alliances should be based on, and I think that's one of the key problems.
Yeah, I'll maybe start from a different angle. There's a book by Dominique Schnapper, French sociologist, called Community of Citizens, and she starts it by saying it's very difficult to imagine today nation states being able to mobilize populations in the way that they did in 1914 or 1939, because there's a crisis of the notion of the nation state. There's a crisis of the national myth, but there's also a crisis of the state in a globalizing era where politicians constantly tell us the state can do less. So therefore the emphasis on the penal aspect of the state, the need to stand up to enemies within, or to police unruly communities, or to create conspiracies in order to achieve an affiliation that can't be generated in positive terms, therefore has to be generated in negative terms, I think helps explain part of the amalgam that we get. And I think it's true that some of these things have to be taken discreetly if you're serious about dealing with, you know, what produces jihadism. I think the role of Western imperialism in the Middle East and in areas where groups have been deliberately encouraged and fostered and so on would be something to look at there. But we're dealing with the generation of a kind of scaremongering, which is it almost becomes hard to unravel because of the nature of the demonization. So your question about the Trojan horse thing, but there's no smoke without fire, essentially. That proves what we've been saying, really. You know, the evidence wasn't there for the conspiracy that was played out in the media for months and months and months. And similarly with the question of allies, the question that was asked of the people who participated in a meeting against Islamophobia in Paris was essentially to set the bar for collaboration with Muslim organisations much higher than you would set it for collaboration with any other group. You know, if you have to assert your credentials on, you know, where did you stand on gay marriage, where do you stand on sexism, before you will allow organisations to participate with Muslims, well, you know, if you applied that in France, nobody would have worked with de Gaulle. There wouldn't have been a resistance movement. You know, so I think there's a deeper crisis taking place that is a crisis of ideas, a crisis of the state that is generating this stigmatisation. It goes beyond simply divide and rule, but I think it means that people have to take it head on and demolish some of these myths. And I think in that process, alliances become easier to form. There's a level of demystification that has to be part of confronting Islamophobia.
A few things. So first off, the British values issue. I feel quite conflicted about this because I think at a theoretical level, societies which operate, broadly speaking, along nationalist principles do need unifying principles and common myths in order to maintain a sense of coherence. But as somebody who identifies with an internationalist movement which would be situated in the global south and is largely a victim of British values, I find defining British values in a sort of exclusivist sense problematic at that level. And then at a second level, I think that actually no discourse obviously happens in a vacuum, and what we see now in terms of the discussion about British values, which is a discussion which I might have been willing to engage with on some level, but because it's currently a top-down imposition of a sort of fixed set of values by Tory politicians, which ultimately only serves the political purpose of marginalising those who are targeted by that discourse, and that's what that discourse is really about. It's not actually about some sort of, you know, pledge to define who we are, because nobody really cared about that until quite recently. So those are some of my issues with the whole discussion on British values. On the Trojan horse thing, we need to be very, very clear on a few things here. The allegations against the schools in Birmingham were allegations of extremism. I would like to read you a quote from Graham Stewart, the Conservative Chair of the Education Select Committee. Apart from one incident, no evidence of extremism or radicalisation was found by any of the inquiries into any of the schools involved. Now, it's important. But it's important to recognise that, because these are people who are being demonised on the basis of what things that are not fact. What you're referring to are issues, I presume, because I've had this discussion too many times, is the fact that there were socially conservative views, and in some cases, socially conservative religious views being taught within these schools. Yes, I would say that the issue with that is in a free country, one would hope that it's permissible still to express views that are A, socially conservative, but B, possibly distasteful. What I might question, and I have questioned in my own writings on the so-called Trojan horse issue, is whether schools should be allowed to teach their own version of what a correct ethos should be. And ultimately, looking at it purely from a government perspective, I think actually schools are agents of socialisation into a broader society, and that as that they should have a unified set of teaching policies rather than what we've seen. But the issue with that is that the deregulation of schools in this country, the buck stops where on that? It stops with the education minister, and it stops with the man who has created the conditions which allow for schools to teach within them according to their own values. And then when brown people in Bradford go and do it, you don't like it, but when yummy mummies at Hampstead are doing it, it's fine. That's called racism, and that's not acceptable.
So I'm glad that you agree that there were issues.
Through the chair, please.
There weren't issues.
Through the chair. Excuse me.
There were no issues of extremism or radicalisation. I need you to acknowledge that. There were no issues of extremism or radicalisation. No, but it's very, very important, because at the moment the line between that and socially conservative views is being blurred, and as a consequence of that, people who hold socially conservative views are being demonised as extremists and radicals. And in doing that, you put people who are, out joining ISIS in the same camp as people who think that, they shouldn't shake hands with women, which I don't approve of necessarily, but it's a free effing country. Let them be. I don't see. The only person I take issue with in this discussion is Michael Gove for creating the conditions within schools for allowing that to happen. The final point is, I don't deny that there are issues of terrorism, and as Sunny actually pointed out earlier on, the primary victims of Muslim terrorism are Muslims themselves. So I believe me, it's not something that I skirt over in my mind. The difference maybe is that I don't consider it to be primarily theologically driven. I think there is a theological narrative in which political motivations are couched. I think if you're trying to articulate political interests in a particular region, you articulate those in the idiom of the people. And the idiom of the people in the Middle East is Islam. So that's how you're going to articulate it. Do I think that ISIS have a particularly profound theological depth in their writings? No. Do I think they actually have much in the way of theological writings? No, I don't. Therefore, when people say to me, and Muslims need to take on this struggle, and people have, I just saw recently there's a launch of this new magazine, Hakika, to try and challenge, Muslims online. Great! I'm delighted. I don't think that's where the solution lies, personally. As somebody who teaches Middle East politics, I'm much more inclined to point to, localized political factors in Syria and Iraq than I am to, some sort of existential crisis within Islam. Feel free to disagree with me. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you to all of us. And thank you to...
By the way, yummy mummies are also very socially conservative.
Yes, indeed they are.
I've watched Made in Chelsea. I know what you're talking about.
So it's the odd Roman Catholic school I could take you to.
Okay. Just before we wrap up, just a final thing. So just stay in your chairs for 1 minute. I just have to say, I went to my kids' school for Parents' Evening, and all schools have got to now display what core British values are. And so there was a poster next to my 9-year-old's school classroom, and it said British values of such and such a school, and it had a little cut-out picture of Buckingham Palace. It had one of the Houses of Parliament. And guess what the third building was? The MI6 building in Vauxhall. I'm serious.
No.
I am serious.
That's kind of serious.
Huh? Well, I appreciate the architecture, but anyway, that's true. I swear that's true. I'm going to I was going to sum up the whole day, but I can't possibly. I do want to thank you all, because actually I think it's been extraordinary. Speakers and everyone. It's been flashing the dialogue, hasn't it? It's follow-ups from last year's conference, which we had this time last year, which I should point out was in collaboration with the LGBT Muslim group Imam. So, the Muslim Institute we want to push forward all these issues. We're not afraid of tackling anything. But I'm going to give the last word to someone who put up their hand and said they wanted to speak. Just speak up, please.
Sorry, I just wanted to respond to the person who spoke about 7/7. He spoke about it being scary. Yes, it is scary, but I can I think the person needs to also put themselves in the shoes of the 1 million Iraqis who got killed, and where Bush turned around and said that he was going to start a crusade. We need to stop. He's just supporting the idea that Muslims again need to come out and apologise for what's going on. It's not fair. It's a very small percentage of people that are committing these crimes, and they should be seen for what they are: murderers, lunatics, not Muslims. And I'm going to just give a quote of what Martin Luther King said. He said, "Never forget that everything Hitler did in Germany was legal. Let's change this course."
And that's the last word. Before you go, please, so we don't have to pack up and take it upstairs, please buy a copy of Critical Muslim. Please, and if you've enjoyed today, right, this event, right, hasn't happened anywhere else, actually, at all. It was up to the Muslim Institute. Actually, it was Samia who said we need to have this conference, and thank you to everyone who's taken part in it, because this is unique. This is what the Muslim Institute is all about. If you like what we do, join the Muslim Institute, join it today, get on the website or join it, buy Critical Muslim, sign up to our newsletter. Please, folks, everyone in this room is extremely valuable. Please join the Institute. Thank you very much.
The new issue of Critical Muslim has just arrived yesterday, so come to me and I'll give you a copy.
Yeah, do we need to... No, that's true.
Anyone owes registration
Is this the latest one? This is the latest one? Yeah. Just tell, if you want to take it, take a copy. Well, she needs to note it. You just tell her you're taking a copy. Okay. Is it 10 each? Is it 10? 10 each, yeah. Sure. That's for today.
Well, this is a fantastic day.
Good.
Really, really good. Really good.
Are you based in London?
Yes, actually, I think you know someone. I know Samia. I'm his co-director.
Oh, right, Hassan. Okay.
And then we know David as well. I think he made a comment in the back room and he's with Myriam as well.
Oh, right, okay.
No, I really enjoyed it. This is fantastic.